People never expect their lives to change in a single night, but for David, that night came without warning. He was a hard-working man, the kind who spent his weekends fixing things around the house and his evenings sitting on the porch, proud of the home he had built with his own 2 hands. To him, this house wasn't just wood and brick, it was years of sweat, sacrifice, and quiet victories. But in his neighborhood, there was one person who seemed determined to erase every ounce of peace he had carved out. Her name was Karen. Karen was the president of the Homeowners Association, a woman who carried rules like weapons and complaints like trophies. At first, her comments seemed harmless, nagging about the color of his front door, shaking her head at the sound of his laughter during family gatherings, even hinting that his garden was too much. But under the thin mask of concern was something far more dangerous: resentment. To her, David didn't belong, and she made sure he felt it at every turn. What David didn't know was that her bitterness was growing into something darker, something that no one in the neighborhood could have predicted. He thought she was just another overbearing HOA leader. He thought her power ended with letters and fines. But in truth, her anger was preparing to take shape in the most destructive way possible, one that would leave David standing in the ashes of everything he loved. It started small. Letters slipped into David's mailbox, each one colder than the last. Karen's handwriting carried sharp words wrapped in official HOA language, but the message was always the same: you don't belong here. She fined him for things no one else was punished for: grass trimmed half an inch too short, a garden decoration she called unapproved, even the shade of paint on his mailbox. Neighbors whispered that Karen was just being herself, always strict, always difficult. But David knew the truth: she was targeting him, and she wouldn't stop until he was gone. Still, David tried to ignore it. He told himself it was only paper, just words meant to break his spirit. But behind those letters was a fire building inside Karen's mind, a dangerous obsession that no rulebook could contain. And one quiet evening, that fire would come alive. David was sitting at his kitchen table, his bills spread out in front of him, when he caught the faintest sound outside, a soft crackle, like twigs snapping in the wind. At first, he thought nothing of it. But then came the smell. Smoke. Thick, heavy, and growing stronger with every breath. His heart raced as he rushed to the front door. What he saw froze him in place. Flames. They were crawling up the side of his home, hungry and fast. He shouted, tried to grab a hose, but it was too late. The fire moved with a fury no water could stop. Within minutes, the home he had built with his own hands was engulfed. David stumbled into the night, choking on smoke, his eyes stinging, as neighbors ran from their houses. He stood there, helpless, as the roof collapsed in a storm of sparks. That night, David lost more than a house. He lost the safe place he had poured his life into. And somewhere in the crowd, hidden behind gasps and whispers, Karen was watching. By the time the last flames were smothered, nothing remained but charred beams and rising smoke. David stood in silence, his hands trembling, his face lit only by the glow of what used to be his home. The fire trucks roared in the background, hoses hissing against the heat, but for David it was all just noise. His chest felt hollow, like the fire had burned right through him. Neighbors gathered at a distance, their voices hushed, eyes wide with shock. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads. The man who had spent years quietly building his dream had just watched it vanish in a single night. But as David turned to the crowd, his gaze locked on something that chilled him even more than the flames. Karen was there. Standing near the edge of the group, arms folded tightly around her robe, her face arranged into a mask of fake concern. She shook her head dramatically, whispered to the neighbor beside her, pretending to share in the sorrow. But David saw it, just for a moment, the flicker in her eyes. Not sympathy. Satisfaction. The fire chief approached, placing a heavy hand on David's shoulder. "We'll find out what caused this," he promised. David nodded, but inside, he already knew. Fires don't start themselves in the dead of night. This was no accident. As the smoke cleared, so did David's thoughts. His home was gone, but his resolve was not. Whoever had done this would answer for it. And though Karen hid behind her mask of innocence, the truth had a way of leaving its own kind of trail, one that even she couldn't cover up forever. The next morning, investigators combed through the ruins. Ash still smoked in the air, and the ground was hot beneath their boots. At first, it looked like nothing more than devastation, but trained eyes knew better. They knelt by the blackened beams, scraping samples, sniffing the soil. Then came the words David had been waiting for: accelerant. This fire hadn't been an accident. Someone had said it, carefully and deliberately. Neighbors began to talk. One recalled seeing Karen's car creeping down the street long after midnight, headlights off, as if she didn't want to be seen. Another swore they heard footsteps near David's yard just before the blaze began. Piece by piece, the story was writing itself, and every line pointed in one direction, straight to Karen. When police showed David the first bits of evidence, his heart pounded. Security footage from a nearby driveway camera showed a car suspiciously similar to hers circling the block that night. The details were grainy, but it was enough to raise questions. And then came the final thread: the pattern of the burn matched accelerant poured deliberately, not a random spark. Word spread quickly through the community. For years, Karen had hidden behind rules, disguising cruelty as order. Now, the image she built was beginning to crumble. David stood in the shadows of what was left of his home, listening to whispers travel like wildfire. Some neighbors looked at Karen with suspicion, others with disbelief. She had been the enforcer of peace, but now she was the suspect of destruction. The next morning, investigators combed through the ruins. Ash still smoked in the air, and the ground was hot beneath their boots. At first, it looked like nothing more than devastation, but trained eyes knew better. They knelt by the blackened beams, scraping samples, sniffing the soil. Then came the words David had been waiting for: accelerant. This fire hadn't been an accident. Someone had said it, carefully and deliberately. Neighbors began to talk. One recalled seeing Karen's car creeping down the street long after midnight, headlights off, as if she didn't want to be seen. Another swore they heard footsteps near David's yard just before the blaze began. Piece by piece, the story was writing itself, and every line pointed in one direction, straight to Karen. When police showed David the first bits of evidence, his heart pounded. Security footage from a nearby driveway camera showed a car suspiciously similar to hers circling the block that night. The details were grainy, but it was enough to raise questions. And then came the final thread: the pattern of the burn matched accelerant poured deliberately, not a random spark. David knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But with every new piece of truth uncovered, the battle was shifting. The place of loss was becoming a place of evidence, and soon, the courtroom would decide what the flames had already revealed. The courthouse was packed the morning David walked in. He wore a borrowed suit, the fabric a little loose around his shoulders, but he carried himself with quiet dignity. This wasn't about appearances, it was about truth. Across the aisle sat Karen, still clinging to her confidence. She whispered to her lawyer, lips curled in a half-smile, as if the trial was nothing more than a misunderstanding she could talk her way out of. But the weight of the charges pressed down on the room like a storm. The judge's voice echoed as the trial began, each word carving the silence. Witness after witness took the stand. A.N. The jurors leaned forward, their expressions shifting from doubt to understanding. Across the aisle, Karen's mask began to crack. Her once steady posture faltered as the mountain of truth grew higher. For the first time, she looked small, fragile, and cornered. David, though still scarred by loss, found strength in that moment. The fire had taken his home, but it had not taken his voice. As the trial neared its climax, the atmosphere inside the courtroom grew heavier with every passing hour. The jury leaned forward, their eyes locked on the prosecutor, who pieced together the story like a puzzle no one could deny. Step by step, the picture became clear: Karen's letters dripping with hostility, her late-night presence near David's home, the accelerant traced back to her purchase. Each fact fell into place until even the whispers in the audience went silent. David sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. He wasn't just reliving the fire, he was reliving every moment that led to it, the nights he stayed awake wondering why he was being targeted, the humiliation of standing in front of neighbors as Karen treated him like an outsider, and the crushing pain of losing the place that once held all his memories. Yet, as the evidence mounted, something inside him shifted. This was no longer just about loss, it was about justice. On the other side, Karen's confidence finally began to crack. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her arms crossed tighter than ever, her once sharp glances darting nervously toward the jury. The power she had wielded for so long was slipping away, replaced by fear. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Every eye turned toward them, the weight of days of testimony resting on their shoulders. David sat still, his hands clasped together, his heart pounding against his chest. Across the aisle, Karen looked pale, her once confident posture replaced by anxious fidgeting. The judge asked for the verdict, and in a steady voice, the foreperson spoke a single word that rang like thunder: guilty. In that instant, everything changed. The facade Karen had worn for years crumbled. She sat frozen, her eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe the world had finally seen through her lies. For David, the word carried more than justice, it carried relief. Though the fire had stolen his home, this moment gave him back something even greater: dignity, peace, and the reassurance that truth had prevailed. The judge delivered the sentence, each word a reminder that actions have consequences. Karen would no longer walk the streets as the untouchable HOA leader, she would face the punishment her cruelty had earned. The same community she once ruled with fear now looked at her with disappointment, even shame. When David walked out of the courtroom, the sun hit his face with a warmth he hadn't felt since before the fire. Neighbors who once stayed silent now stood by his side, some offering words of support, others extending hands to help him rebuild. Though the ashes of his home still remained, he carried with him something stronger than walls or roofs, the knowledge that no one, not even someone as powerful as Karen once seemed, could take away his truth. Karen had tried to burn him down, but in the end, she was the one consumed by the flames of her own making.